Hello, Terry Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here again, and this time I'm going to talk about the latest code and kind of walk through some of the structure if I can do that without being too difficult to understand. I know a lot of this. I do a lot of pointing. I just went back and watched a video. I do a lot of pointing, and I point to the wrong things, and still I'm saying some of the wrong things. So this isn't a great education. This is probably more documentation for myself in the future than anything. We're getting pretty deep here. I'm seeing a few people have watched the top level videos, but then it dies off by the time it gets to here. So obviously this stuff isn't super exciting. To me, it's interesting, and I'm kind of proud of a few of the things I've figured out how to make them work. But it's still a work in progress, and things are going to change quite a bit still even. So let's kind of talk about how the code runs and what the flow is. I should really have a some kind of a flow chart at some point. I should build something to make it more obvious as to what's happening. But basically everything starts from routing, right? The dashboard shows the dashboard view. So if we were to look at the routing component, which is right here, I'm in the router index.js file. That's my routing component. And obviously dashboard, wherever it is, the dashboard loads the dashboard component. You have to be authorized to get in. That's code that I had to write to make that happen. But the dashboard component loads the dashboard view. So if I go and find the dashboard view, that's where we're seeing the list of caregivers. So this right here, primary kinship caregivers, is right here, and then we do a for loop on the different clients. I'm using clients here. I should be using kinship caregivers, but that's a computed variable that I go and find. Clients is computed off of the current primary relative caregivers. How does it get that? Well, when it's created, so when this page first loads, when I'm here and I hit enter, as soon as the view is created, when it pops up, you saw that it popped up empty and then it loaded. So that is what's happening here. It's the created function gets called when the view is all set up. That's why we saw the visual of it empty, and then it goes out to the store and says, hey, go and get me the list of primary kinship caregivers. So if I go and look in the storage, which is my Vuex component, I have my database functionality in there. And so if let's just do a find. If where was I? Did I lose that other file? I'm in client container. I want dashboard. Where's dashboard? Dashboard. I don't know why I haven't learned Visual Studio Code well enough to understand why sometimes they close out other ones when they open up. So where's my store? And so again, I was saying that when the created runs, we start the program with get kinship primary kinship caregivers. So let's find that. There's the function there. So all that does is that reaches out to the storage, and it gets the collection, primary kinship caregiver. It does a get, and the get retrieves all of them. I haven't learned yet how to do the limiting functionality. Obviously, if you had 30,000 clients, you wouldn't want to load them all, and there's nothing here saying, hey, well, actually, this gets the reference. This gets the reference, and then I loop through each one, and I put them in a list. So I'm not sure if I can limit, just get me 10. I can probably do a query. I haven't got into this field yet, but I think I can do a query and say, hey, get me, the ones that start with letters of first names or something like that. Anyway, I go and I get that collection, and I pull it back, and then what I'm doing here is I just loop through every single one. So it gets the collection or a reference to it, and then it calls this promise then, which runs my function, and I do a for each on what's passed in. I do a for each and just throw every single one of those every single one of those doc IDs into a variable here. So that's the kinship caregiver object, and then I store that on the current primary relative caregivers within the state. Now this is not actually very good code. I haven't gone back and refactored this code or worked on it because I am right now right here. This is changing state. I am mutating state within an action. This is, I called dispatch, remember? I called dispatch, and dispatches are actions. Actions are asynchronous. Well, I've got a lot of code these days. I got to start segmenting that out. But actions are asynchronous code, and you don't want to do mutations on your database. So technically, I should call from where I was. From here, I shouldn't be directly mutating it. I should be calling a context.commit. So it should be context.commit. And then I should have a function that I pass this variable to that then goes ahead and sets this. I'm just going to back that out. But I'm doing it here, and the reason I've talked about in the past, you can do it here and it's going to work fine, but with your debugging tools, this ViewX component here, this is a plugin that you can get. This ViewX component won't see those changes right away. So it makes debugging a little bit harder, which is why you want to use mutations. Now, I think it is showing up at this point because I've called other things, so the store has recognized. Let's see. Actually, no, right? I don't have that global state, so I did set this. All these caregiver IDs that I just got from this query, I stuck them in a current primary kinship caregivers on the state, and oh, there it is. So it is there. So I'm not sure why it is there. It shouldn't be there based on my past experience with calling mutations. So I'm not exactly sure why that happened. It might be because I set the root level. If you set the root level, it may actually update. I'm not sure. Anyway, you're supposed to call a mutation there, and not supposed to do it directly from the actions section. You're supposed to call mutation. That was really delved in about that. So that's how we get that, right? So this does its functionality. It stores the list on top of current primary kinship relative caregivers. So if I go back to the dashboard, once that's dispatched, that'll fill in, and notice my clients is based on that same variable. So in the beginning, before this loads, this returns null because this doesn't exist. And well, it does, but it's null. Let's take a look at my declarations. So there it is there, and it's false. So it returns false. And so when my layout here tries to loop over it, it's looping over a false and getting nothing. That should really be null. I'm surprised I'm not getting an error for trying to loop over false, but I guess you can. And once this asynchronous dispatch goes out, it goes to the store, it goes to Firebase, gets the objects, sends them back here, and the reactive part of View then takes over and says, hey, this is a computed variable, something has changed here, go back and update the interface, and so then it reruns all of this, and that's why we saw that it started out as 0. These were not there when it first loaded, and then they popped in because that was that whole functionality that I was just talking about. So we'll see it load and then pop in. That's the asynchronous functionality of that database call going out, coming back, and filling in that computed variable. So that's the first part of the program. Then we start walking into how do we get down into each of the clients, right? If I add new or if I look at someone. So let's talk about looking at someone. Clicking on that caused the router to change. So it's got a well, let's go back. I'll hover it. Watch down here. That's the link that it's going to go to. The local host is that'll end up being the www. whatever. Right now I'm in a local development environment. So when I click on that, that's going to follow that link, which takes me to view this particular primary relative, this primary kinship caregiver. 919 is currently me. That's who I clicked on, my name. So this is the information about me. So what happened there when I clicked on that? Well, I called this route primary kinship caregiver with a variable. So if we look at the routing, and again, I lost that. So let's just reorder these back. There's my router. So when I call something that looks like primary kinship caregiver with some type of something after it that's a variable and nothing after it for this to identify by, it's going to load this path. And it's going to pass this variable through as a property. That's what that says. It's going to load this new thing called the client container. Now the interesting thing is I am now loading the client container for every type of view. So really all I'm defining is the different links that can take me back to the client container. And so maybe I could have multiple paths. I haven't looked into it so that I didn't have to do all of this. But basically all these are the same. All these different routes lead back to the same container and sends whatever variables that come through, sends them through to that container because of this props true variable. So what's going to happen is this is what was loaded. This was loaded as a variable. It's just a random string. It picks up on that and says, hey, it didn't match anything else that was hard-coded, so let's take this string and have it match. And it passed it through to the client container. So let me find the client container. And so it loads this view. So this you see is dashboard. Let's see. No, that's the link. That is the breadcrumbs. So this is the client container. This breadcrumbs always gets loaded no matter what route I choose. Because I'm loading the component client container for no matter what route gets matched, I get this. This is always output. All this stuff until I get to a VIF is output. So this dashboard is a link back to the dashboard, and then I have this breadcrumbs thing where I go and compute the breadcrumbs. I'll show that on the front end first. So that's this right here. There's no breadcrumbs to compute, but if I get down into like a child, now my breadcrumbs are being computed. The dashboard is always there, and then that breadcrumbs that's being computed shows up. So if I go into add income, so now you can see this is the income on David. So I'm increasing my breadcrumbs. And how am I doing that? That's a computed variable that comes from down here. And basically I say if certain properties are passed in, kinship child ID is a property. Well, actually, yeah, this kinship child comes from my properties. Let's see, where is it? This .kinship child ID. I don't know why it's not highlighting, but it should be this right here. Kinship child ID. There, now it's highlighting both. That comes from the props, which is passed in because of the route I was at. So whichever one that is, this would be the kinship child ID, I think. That's the one that gets passed in. So that would be when it matches this one, kinship child ID, when it matches this. So I must be on the state primary kinship relative caregiver with a kinship child. Primary kinship relative caregiver with a kinship child. That variable is available to be passed in. So that's probably this state right here for what I showed to in the routing. So kinship child, and then the kinship child ID is passed into that component. So here again is the route, the kinship child component, and then it passes what comes after it as a property to the calling component, which is client container. And I found out that, and I don't know if I'm cheating here or if this is legitimate. Notice that when I call client container is expecting every single variable possible, but I'm not always passing them in. I'm not passing in others in household when this route is called. There's no others in household in here. It's actually down in one of these variables when those routes are called. But again, they're all calling the client container. So they actually come through, and I think you can have default, I think you can set it as a default, but they come through to the props. Am I in the right one? No, I'm in the wrong one. They come through to the props. The ones that aren't identified when I pass through are null. So, everything after here in that one route I was just looking at is null, but these two are going to get loaded, and therefore kinship child ID in the breadcrumbs is available, and so it pushes on, the link that to its parent, and that's something I create, and it creates the what it's going to display, the full name based on another computation here after it gets all the entities. So I'll talk about those maybe another time, but basically I check the store to see if the entity has loaded yet for whatever the function is, the kinship child full name. I need to make sure that the entity is loaded, because remember, my database starts out as empty, and so and plus everything's reactive, so I need to react for the situation that nothing has loaded yet, because everything's asynchronous. The database calls are asynchronous, so there's a state. Remember, when that when everything is first loading, we should see everything be small and then get loaded in. Well, it wasn't small because the field had shape, but you saw that the values got loaded in a second. This one probably started small. Let me look at that one again. This one will start out without anything in it and then expand once it loads. That's that asynchronous activity. So I have to handle that, this stuff could be empty and not there. And if it is, then I just return, an empty string for the name. Once it has loaded, again, it's reactive. View is reactive. So once all this stuff does load it recomputes all this, and that's when we see things pop into place. So anyway, that's really, I need to go further into that. I know that's not very good explanation, but there's only so much time in the 17 minutes I've already talked for. So that's a brief interview into the breadcrumbs. So that always gets loaded, and then I've got these components that I load. So now is when I load the view that you want to see based on whatever came through from the route. So if the kinship child ID is available, then I'm going to load either the child or the child income view. So that would be, here the child is available, and so I have a VIF on this template, which is going to allow these two to show. So kinship child is there. Kinship child income ID is not there. So this one will show up and this one won't because of the negation operator. This one, the kinship child entity shows up. Well, kinship child, where does that come from? That's a template I import into my components. So it calls here's the kinship child that gets called, and it comes from components kinship child. So there's the kinship child view, and here we see kinship child, and it's going to load. So that's why we see this right here. The incomes is then loaded underneath it. Here's the incomes, and it is a loop that loops over kinship child income, which is another, again, a computed variable that gets pulled from down in my computed here, which is based on whether or not everything has reached out to the store yet. So you can kind of see that I'm loading the views based on the variables that are passed in, and then I reach out to the store and get those variables. So I'm going to stop there, and then I'll do another video and talk about, that's kind of the layout of how the layouts get loaded, but what starts the data from being loaded. Back here, remember, we had a created function that loaded stuff. So now when I load this first load, remember, this calls the component container, or the client container, which itself has a created function, and then it has some functionality that goes out ultimately to the store and gets the entity, starts the entity process. So I'll talk about that in another video about how I start populating the entities for a given view. So Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers, again, just documenting the how the app is currently working. I hope you find this at least somewhat intelligible and understandable. Have a great day. Happy coding.